All right, welcome everybody to the Lion's Den. I have my guest with me, Craig Truglia. Thank you so much for coming on, bro. To the Lion's Den.
Oh, look, now I got two Subdeacon Daniels right there. Now it's great to be here.
Nestorianism, bro. So, so Craig, I've been on your show so many times. Thank you for coming on mine. For anyone who doesn't know Craig, you should all know Craig. You shouldn't know me. Uh, for anyone who doesn't know Craig, he's the content creator at orthodoxchristiantheology.com and the corresponding YouTube channel, Orthodox Christian Theology. He is an Eastern Orthodox Christian in the Chalcedonian tradition. And like I said, we did many shows together before, whether disagreeing and agreeing. We have shows where I think the Ephesus 1 and 2, maybe even Ephesus 2 shows could be counting as agreeing. And then we have shows where we respectfully disagree with each other. And I think the shows that we've done on the Oriental Orthodox versus Eastern Orthodox discussion, in my opinion, have been groundbreaking for a lot of people looking into the subject, because they are not so much polemical. It's just two buddies having a conversation about it on different sides of the spectrum. So thank you again, Craig, for coming on. I appreciate it, man.
Well, it's great to be on, and I wish I could be more informative on this topic. I remember the first discussions we did have on reason and theology, and I just said forthrightly that Subdeacon Daniel's going to be much more invested in this issue than I am. And so, we have to pay careful attention to what you have to say on these things. But on this particular topic, I feel that there's a lot of agreement. There's a lot of continuity between what we're going to see the Severus take on the issue of aphthartodocetism. And just so people, if they're not aware, it's because I was researching the entire history of the Dormition homily genre that if you're going to do that, you need to read Severus. You need to understand what his takes on these issues was. And I was very surprised to find how much misinformation there was. It's actually not that complicated if you care to pay attention. And it seems to me there's a lot of misinformation, at least in the English language discourse. I can't speak for any other. And I think a lot of that's going to be cleared up by this show. So that's why I'm very excited.
Thanks, Craig. So yeah, Julianism. Craig has put in work into Julianism. He's read Severus on it. This is going to be one of those shows, like I mentioned earlier, that we are on the same page on. Um, and I'm really excited to kind of get into it because I think Craig's perspective, I think he's going to come at it from an anthropological thing to show uh, kind of this common heritage that Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox continue to share in the way they view the nature of humanity, even before the fall. Um, I don't know if you want to just get into it, Craig, or however you want to.
Sure, yeah, I on that note, I just want to add that I'm the outsider looking in, ultimately, right? I'm the Eastern Orthodox person trying to read this as well as I can as a historian, really, right? It's reading like a historian because these, the people that I'm going to be talking about aren't my saints. And you could appreciate even someone who's not your saint, what they're saying and what they're getting at. And you could even they're endearing to you. You get into enough historical resources, certain characters in history are very endearing. I find Severus very endearing, and maybe I'll get into that when I introduce Severus after we get into Cyril of Alexandria. But I wanted to say from the onset is despite how endearing I could find the writings of Severus, the drawback for me, and my apologies to your audience, is that because I am the outsider, I am not going to have the appreciation that I should have. And so, if we all come out of this with a greater appreciation and go, wow, Craig really got really to the nitty gritty what Severus was getting at and denouncing Julian of Halicarnassus, then how much more great would this been if Severus was my saint. And so hopefully this will be something for everyone who's watching and listening, that it will motivate them to take a closer look at Severus, and particularly the Oriental Orthodox, because they're going to have the advantage of having a labor of love more so than me. It's always easier to do something you love than something you just simply like. So it's I apologize in advance. I am an outsider, but
thank you for that, Craig. I want to add the maybe when you get to the Severus thing, I'll hold what I'm going to say to that. Go ahead.
All right. So I guess I'll introduce it like this way. It's popularly speaking, scholars, mainstream articles like OrthoWiki, they either will say very incomplete things about aphthartodocetism, like to quote OrthoWiki. Now, this is not technically wrong what they say, but it says, is a form of monophysitism. Again, OrthoWiki is an Eastern Orthodox website. My apologies. They don't say meophysitism.
It is monophysitism. We agree.
Well, okay. So, all right. It's a form of monophysitism that argues Christ's body was always impassible, a doctrine which Julian believed was necessary for Christ's suffering and death to have been voluntary. All right. Now, everything from a technical point and including what you just said is actually accurate, right? Because the whole idea that Christ was incorruptible is this like permanent deification of the human flesh. And it's almost as if human nature stops actually having its real properties, right? Which we'll get into. So it's not inaccurate, but here's what a lot of people take away from this, and this includes scholars. They take away, if you ever even mention that Christ wasn't going to, you had no sin, he was never going to corrupt, he was never going to die, he voluntarily died, he voluntarily corrupted, people go, well, that's aphthartodocetism. And that's what people will say. And you have to I don't think you know what that word means. I know there's a meme somewhere where it says that. I don't think you know what that word means. And so that's why I like to say this presentation is going to be aphthartodocetism according to Julian of Halicarnassus. So that way you get the real nitty gritty of what it really is. And I think why it's important that we say, well, there's a aberrant version of Christ voluntarily suffering and dying, because there's a true version which is absolutely necessary, and it shouldn't even be remotely close to debatable, right? And I'll quote Henoticon a little later, but for the Eastern Orthodox, we have a decree of an ecumenical council, and we have a canon in Constantinople II. So we have two ecumenical councils invoke this doctrine. And so to even imply, well, there's something heretical about this doctrine when it's it doesn't get any more authoritative by anyone's standards. When it's a decree of the council, it's a canon. Eastern Orthodox have to pay attention. I know less about exactly what is dogmatic for the Beaphysite communion. So being that it's in Henoticon, I don't know if that's essentially an ecumenical council for you guys or not. But certainly it's in the writing of your saints, and it's something that is very important. And what I fear, though fear less for you guys than for my guys, is I fear that due to the misnomers in the Western discourse on this topic, that it could corrupt your teaching, just like it could corrupt our teaching.
I see.
Right? And that we can have. I think, thankfully, there's been less permeation of the whole Western academic paradigm in Oriental Orthodoxy. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all. I mean, every single patriarch's gone to Harvard or Yale or Oxford, right? So obviously, the creme de la creme are sadly being inundated, which I think with a lot of useless and incorrect information. But generally speaking, that inundation is still much less in the Eastern Orthodox. And it goes without saying, it's even far less in Roman Catholics, Protestants, which are totally secularized. Now, that being said,
just for general information for the the viewer, Julian's name is listed in every list of official anathemas in Oriental Orthodox. In Syriac.
Yeah, so he's bad.
Absolutely, yeah. He's right there with Eutyches.
But there's, I'll quote Moss in this in a little bit. There's parts where Julian and Severus, or Julian what's correct, comes so close, right, where people could get very confused. And that's I'm really hoping this clears up. Now, I've been actually contacted by one scholar fairly recently who was absolutely scandalized by this doctrine. And I quoted a fellow Greek compatriot that used to live in his country now, Christopher Veneman. He translates in Gregory Palamas' homilies. He now lives in Pennsylvania. But I said, this is not like something some crazy guy on the internet like me came up with. I can name several scholars that recognize this. And if I went down the list, it'd be Richard Price, Booth, I forget his first name at the top of my head right now, who co-wrote Lateran 649. You got Benjamin Heidgerken. You have Romanides, Staniloae. You got people up the wazoo. This is not like a fringe. This is not like something even in scholarship that's fringe, right? Like scholars in the know this is the case. But I'll just quote this because I think it's a good one-liner for our purposes from Christopher Veneman. He said, Christ's body was indeed passible and mortal, but only as and when he, the Son, the Word, and Word of God allowed it to be so. Right? So this is what I quoted to the other scholar that was so scandalized by this. I go, this is not something I'm some random nobody pulling this up. How do you explain this is what Veneman's talking about? Are you going to call him a nut too? And the issue is, it sounds very scandalous, but what I just read is not aphthartodocetism. And then we got to keep that in mind. That one-liner, Christ's body was indeed passible and mortal, but only as and when he, the Son, the Word of God, allowed it to be so, is not technically aphthartodocetism. But aphthartodocetism is something that we can very clearly delineate. But before we get there, we really got to talk about Cyril of Alexandria. He's a mutual saint for both of us. And really, I think this whole controversy is just like if we look at future controversies in Eastern Orthodoxy come from Chalcedon. Well, this controversy comes from stuff from what I could tell was not settled by Cyril. And particularly, I think what we need to look at is St. Cyril of Alexandria's anthropology, his doctrine of original sin. Right? So people say original sin is not something that Orthodoxy teaches. It's from the West. And you kind of marvel at this because, like, I don't think you get much more Eastern of a saint than Cyril, right? He's not like a crypto-Latinist or anything like that. Right? So I'm going to quote Cyril here. And this is in his commentary on Romans. He says that corruptibility through Adam's disobedience entered human experience, and therefore the passions entered in. Right? So disobedience brings in corruptibility and the passions. Now, he says, the curse of corruption has passed from the earthly Adam even to us, and through our corruption, the law of sin entered in the members of the flesh. So, right, it's inheritable. It's inherited from Adam. So, original sin. Now, we don't see anything here like original guilt, but I'm going to imagine that's not even something that's even tossed around at all within Oriental Orthodoxy. It's just, it would be so foreign to you never even look at these words and jump to those conclusions. I mean, would that be fairly accurate, or is there some sort of Augustinianism being trying to be shoehorned in to?
No. I would. I don't know if you caught it once. We did a show with Dr. Sebastian Brock, and he was asked the question of Augustine's influence in Oriental Orthodoxy, and Brock said there is none. His translating Augustine into Syriac happened by the Jesuits, or whenever the Uniatism started over there in the 18th century or whatever it was. So that Augustine doesn't have so much of an influence at that point at all.
And so I just feel like it's interesting because in the West, even among the Eastern Orthodox, they'll read these things and be surprised because they think it's Augustinian. And it's like, well, if you're not automatically presuming inherited guilt as a presupposition, it has nothing to do with it, right? So many things people presume upon because they think they know what it sounds like, but it sounds nothing like that to the uninitiated. Like they're not initiated in the Augustinianism or the Roman Catholicism, and so what I just read would anyone else reading Cyril would go, no, it has nothing to do with that, and of course it doesn't. The second quote I just quoted was from On the Unity of Christ, and so I think what's important in unpacking Cyril is when we're trying to figure out Adam's sin, right? We talked, brings corruptibility in the passions, but what's the connection between the two? And I think from what I can tell from Cyril, and I'm very open to correction more from him because I'm not a Cyril completist. Like there's certain saints where I've read everything they ever wrote, right? So I guess I'm a completist, and you actually get to the point where you kind of understand how they tick. I'm not there with Cyril, and because it's expensive to be there with him. He wrote a lot, so it's a little bit selfish. But that being said, it's to me, from what I could tell, and what I could also see in secondary scholarship, it's not clear if passibility, right? That's the ability to feel pain, privation, tiredness, and other blameless passions. And I don't know about Oriental Orthodoxy, but Severus also calls them essentially blameless passions. So I think that's a valid category thought for both of us.
Sure.
And so it's not clear whether blameless passions and blameworthy passions, or what was called the law of sin by Cyril, entered human experience at the same time, or one then the other, right? And so we're going to find that Severus comes down hard. It's then one, then the other. And this is very, very important, because if you have that understanding, you cannot have aphthartodocetism. And so that is settled for your communion by Severus, but Severus isn't our saint. So who settled it for us, right? Is a good question. And the individual is it's going to interest people, St. Maximus, right? So Severus predates St. Maximus on this important harmonization of Cyril's thought. So I'm going to quote St. Maximus, Questions Thalassius, and I just asked the Oriental Orthodox audience to, one, humor me as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and second, to appreciate that Severus came first, right? So like you could read this and go, yeah, it's good, but Severus came first, so it should give you some appreciation. And so Maximus wrote, on account of the universal sin inherent in human passibility, operating through unnatural passions concealed under the guise of the natural passions, or blameworthy passions concealed under blameless passions. Through the unnatural passions, and by exploiting nature's passibility, every evil power is actively at work, driving the inclination of the will by means of the natural passions into the corruption of unnatural passions. And so let me unpack this really fast. What he's saying is man has this desire. It could be nothing bad at all. Let's say for Adam in the garden, it would be desire to live. For Eve in the garden, desire to live. That's part of human nature, is to exist. I mean, even paramecia want to exist. If you look under the microscope, it's all living life forms. That's a basic desire. It's not even a blameless passion. It's just the desire to exist is innate in nature. But then how does sin come about? Well, you have a desire, and then once the desire acts upon what is called the blameless passions, right? So Adam acts upon the desire, and because desire to live now connotes that he won't have to abide in God, now he has a privation. And that's a blameless passion, is privation. You don't have the health you ought to have. You don't have the energy you ought to have. That doesn't make you sinful, but it's a result of sin. But then that blameless passion becomes the way a blameworthy passion, sin actually enters the person, right? Now, this whole way of thinking is in Severus. So this is very important because Maximus kind of lays this out because he had to deal with monoenergism. And I find this interesting because this is not something I'm an expert in, Subdeacon. But from what I've heard, the accusation is monoenergism was a heresy that they've borrowed from the moderate Severians. And I think that Severus actually uses the word monoenergist. But it's interesting as to, well, are they conceptually identical? Because Severus approaches this in the same way Maximus does. I don't know. I'm going to guess they're not. But maybe they are. Maybe Chalcedonian monoenergism would be aberrant, correctly understood, to modern Oriental Orthodox today and to Severus beforehand. Not during the 7th century, because they actually went into communion. But it's something worthy to consider. Because why is this relevant? Let's just apply this to you and me. A desire could be health, right? We want, good health is a good thing. Now, a blameless passion would be to need good health. Now, a beautiful looking woman walks by, and it wouldn't be wrong to desire, if she's beautiful, generally that connotes health, right? You don't look at really unhealthy people and see them as good looking, obviously, right? So if I'm going to guess like what the good thing about good looks is, it connotes health, and health is a good thing, right? But sin is the misuse of good things. That's the whole point of what Maximus is saying here. And so if you have this privation of health so that you look at something healthy and it's good, but now it enters in, and then the blameworthy passion is, oh, she's healthy, I'd like to have healthy children of that woman, which I guess would be a very neutral way to put it. Something, are you there? It looks like you're frozen, or that you're very stone-faced.
Oh,
No, you're moving. All right, so you're good. So, I mean, like, I'm taking a long time to unpack this, but the reason this is important, because it shows you that sin enters in because there's corruption and blameless passion, and then the misuse of will takes, let's say, a blameless passion, and it becomes a blameworthy passion, right? It's a hierarchy. Cyril doesn't look like he unpacked that hierarchy, but it's something that Severus did, and it's going to be very relevant to the question of aphthartodocetism. Now, another thing I want to touch on, because you pointed out how monophysitism and Julianism is the same thing, is, all right, well then, how does Cyril avoid getting into monophysitism, right? Because he taught Christ is one incarnate nature, right? The incorruptible, immortal Word of God is now in the likeness of sinful flesh, right? Well, how does that work without inventing Julianism? And I think Cyril devised a theological solution. From what I could tell, he did so novelly, though the solution isn't novel. It's found in Western saints very explicitly and actually very early. You can find it in St. Hippolytus. I know he wrote in Greek, but I don't know how much Hippolytus was actually circulated in Egypt. Hilary Poitiers, St. Ambrose, St. Augustine. And Cyril's solution was the same as this patristic solution, which is that Christ voluntarily assumed the results of Adam's transgression. So the quote St. Cyril quite forthrightly. He, that's Christ, willingly underwent his other suffering, so he bore this also of his own will. All right? Elsewhere, he says in the letter to the monks, that was in his commentary in John, in the letter to the monks of Egypt, he wrote that in an economy, Christ allowed death to pull down his flesh. Right? So as you could see, like, Christ's body was prelapsarian, right? He was sinless, and thereby incorruptible and impassible as a matter of just, he wouldn't corrupt and wouldn't die, he wouldn't feel pain. But Christ experienced true corruptibility and passibility, an actual experience of the blameless passions, but via volunteerism. All right? And so, without this volunteerism, you would have something like Julian taught. Because, like, according to Cyril, and this is in the first letter of Sixensis, since human nature was suffering corruption because of Adam's transgression and tyrannized by innate impulses of the flesh, it was necessary that the Word of God should be incarnated, and from the time that human flesh became the personal flesh of the Word, it had ceased to be subject to corruption. Right? And so, in short, how does deified flesh that is no longer subject to corruption, it's totally sinless, it's totally vivified by the grace of God, as a permanent, abiding, default state, right? Because the person of Christ is fully God and fully human. And so his humanity is fully deified. It can't corrupt. It can't die. But voluntarily it did. So, right? Julian tries to talk about how voluntarily it did, and he makes category errors. All right? And so I'm sorry I'm speaking so apologetically, because people are going to think when I'm expounding aphthartodocetism due to the misinformation surrounding it.
No, you're putting it perfectly, Craig, because really that is simplified what he did. He made categorical errors, and it ended up with him being an official heretic by everyone. You know, so, yeah.
Heretic. We could all get on board in condemning Julian. Now, for people to appreciate what Saint Cyril taught, he said about Christ that his flesh was holy and perfectly pure. He was entirely free from the stains and emotions natural to our bodies, and from that inclination which leads us to what is not lawful. Right? And so the way Christ experienced humanity was this condescension. He was his totally holy and perfectly pure flesh. And so he had obviously no blameworthy passions, no depression, nothing like that, no grief or self-pity meaning. But Christ had blameless passions, right? He had privation. He was able to shed tears for the sake of showing compassion to others. He knew what it's like to be subject to injustice and things like this. And so it's a very, very high Christology. And we can see why someone like Julian, who quite frankly was much less intelligent than Severus, Julian wrote with apparently a team of people, because he could find this in Severus' writings where he says, you and your compadres, pretty much. I'm pretty sure compadres is in the original language. You'll have to look it up.
No, you're right. He had like a Martin Luther type of team.
Yeah, like Julian has this whole team, and Severus in exile single-handedly just owns him. So it's Julian was not the mind that Severus was. That's for sure. And so, as I alluded to previously, this is something that was in the Henoticon. And the Henoticon for how many years? Almost 50 years. Almost 50 years was the gold standard for the whole church, non-Chalcedonian and Chalcedonian, other than Rome. And just so people know, in Rome, under Pope Laurentius, more commonly known as the anti-pope, but you have not known that if you lived in Rome. In fact, the church of, I think it's St. Paul, still has, where they have the portraits of the popes, it's Laurentius that's the pope in the portrait, not Symmachus. Symmachus was the pope that was the imperial chosen pope by the Ostrogoths, and he lived outside the city of Rome. It's interesting. Obviously, I favor Symmachus and not Laurentius. Laurentius was he's in agreement with you and not with me. I'll just leave it at that. But the pope before Laurentius was Anastasius, and they were in communion with Thessalonica, which had confessed the Henoticon, and for all intents and purposes were in communion with the non-Chalcedonian church. And so this gets very much ignored, because in the West, it's kind of embarrassing to both the Chalcedonians, whether Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. But the fact of the matter is, the Henoticon was big, and that included even in Rome, even if there was no synodical subscription ceremony. There was obviously a tolerance of it for two popes. And if you want to say one pope and one anti-pope, fine, but it shows you there was a strong faction in Rome that was also in favor of this as well. And let me quote what the Henoticon said on this issue. He says, "For we say that both the miracles and the sufferings," interestingly, the word sufferings is pathe. People, that's the word passions in the Greek, right? So we say it in English, we're not thinking about it. For we say that both the miracles and the sufferings which he willingly endured in the flesh are one, right? It's a matter of Christ's will. Later Chalcedonian clarifications on this are much more detailed and about the voluntaristic aspect of this. But for example, anyone who studies, I think it's Forness. Didn't Forness write the book about Jacob of Sarug? Am I getting the wrong name?
Yeah, it is Forness.
All right, so Forness, for example, writes emphatically that Jacob Sarug understood what the pointed issue was, the voluntary assumption of the blameless passions. And so anyone who read the Henoticon knew that was the pointed issue. So maybe people arguing the internet would say, oh, that one sentence is not clear enough. It would have been more than clear for everyone who read it back in the day, is my point. And the scholars that are in the know understand that, yes, this is how they understood it. But like I referred to previously, the Council of Constantinople II actually essentially paraphrases the Henoticon, and in one of its canons it says, "The same are the miracles and the suffering that's Christ, voluntarily endured in the flesh." Right? And I think some of this is the word willingly and voluntarily might be the same Greek word, it's just how they translate it in English. But you can see it's saying the same thing. What the Henoticon said was so important, they had to then go canonize it when they got rid of the Henoticon. Right, because it wasn't a negotiable. It's a non-negotiable for us and Christologically. Now let's get to Severus. So we keep kind of beating around the bush, and we got to talk about Severus. And this is where, please interrupt me. But I want to say some nice things about Severus, and you know more nice things about Severus than I do. Severus was a Roman patriot. I know that's an anachronism, but because people didn't think of citizenship as we think of it today, and they didn't think of patriotism as we think of it today, obviously. But I'm saying this as a condescension to the audience. They can understand. He was loyal to the Roman state. He was a brilliant writer. He wrote single-handedly when he was in exile. He was the canonical, the canonical patriarch of Antioch, and he was deposed. I won't get into, I obviously will say it's canonical because I have to, right? I have to be wed to that, and you'll say no. But the point was, he was deposed, but he took it manfully and in good sport. And I think rightfully so suspected there could have been a time for him to make a comeback. And so he continued working with the Byzantine state as much as it was possible. He never stopped. He kept on the diptychs, Chalcedonians, which created a lot of controversy in his day. He did not rebaptize the Chalcedonians. In fact, if I remember right, he didn't rechrismate them either. He said, yes, they're in heresy, but there's nothing invalid at their sacraments. And there were, I would say, the rigorists, which Severus was before he was actually a patriarch. He was, at least he'd said some rigorous things on the sacraments. That he realized we're one church of disagreements, and we need to work these things out. And so Severus was not a firebrand. I think sometimes people they'll take heretics and they go, here's this awful person stirring the pot. And that's what the heretic is all about. And if you're Eastern Orthodox, it's just not historically accurate to understand Severus in that light. He was not a firebrand. He was very much a moderate. And I think if I understood the Christological points at issue between him and the Chalcedonians of his day, then that would be where it would jump out at me more, where he would be more divisive. But he otherwise, it doesn't come across as a divisive figure. He was intentionally not divisive. In fact, his original letter, I think first two letters to Julian, when Julian first started spouting this insanity, was like, come on. He's like, I'm sure you don't mean it the way you're saying it. And let's not talk about it right now. We got enough problems right now. Right? That's literally what he wrote to Julian. He tried to diffuse it, and then Julian insulted him pretty much, and he tried to diffuse it again. Very much like Cyril and Nestorius, actually.
I was just
right? Right? And it's interesting. He's the Patriarch of Antioch. Julian's just some random bishop in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. Right? And he was taking it in stride and humility. You gotta really appreciate where Severus was coming from. And I'll just say one thing to throw you guys a bone, which is there were Chalcedonians saying very heretical things in Severus' day, like things that were crypto-Nestorian, things that were very wrong. Denying, for example, that God suffered in the flesh, like pretty basic doctrines you have to affirm. And so you could kind of see why Severus would have took the stance he did. And not necessarily have been even been bad. He would have been objected to things that us Chalcedonians wouldn't affirm today, right? Like we go, no, this is wrong. And so I suspect, and this is where, if you have a future episode on this, I know, and he's just too smart for me. I've watched it, I think 3 times. One of the videos that David Urhan has done on Severus is I think because Severus was so brilliant, he harmonized and synthesized parts of Cyril's thought, which became a real advance. And it would have not been a logically, I presume, I'm sure Dave would actually disagree when it comes to logic, but it wouldn't be necessarily terribly illogical and terribly disconnected from Cyril. Severus was too smart for that. Yeah. And so the reason I bring it, but it would have been just like Maximus is a Chalcedonian advance. Right? We understand that our doctrines clarify. People want to ask questions. We could talk about what we understand as doctrinal development versus perhaps maybe the Newman's view, because I think people could confuse it. But Severus did clarify and develop things. And I think we have to, me speaking to Eastern Orthodox, we have to appreciate because he was responding to things that were truly aberrant. And usually that's where you get clarifications, where you're responding to something aberrant. Now, obviously, Severus is condemned by my church, so I would understand, being a loyal son of my church, that the clarifications made were ultimately wrong. But not on the anthropological issue. That is what we are talking about here today. So, having said that, please interrupt, say whatever you want, because I'm like taking over your channel.
That was really good. I just wanted to say, and I told you this before, Severus, from all my Eastern Orthodox friends who have read Severus, I haven't met one who is not a fan, a crypto fan of Severus in some way or another. They're like, this guy reads amazing. John Baer has been trying for years to exonerate Severus, and
then Origin, then everybody. But
yeah. A lot of people I know in my personal life, very well-read, educated Eastern Orthodox people like yourself, that'll go further than you would go and say, like, especially in the Antiochian church, they love reading Severus. So it makes me happy.
But I can see that, though. Like, there's Eastern Orthodox that were like reading Bonaventure and stuff, right? So like you could take an interest in, or who's that Anglican, like C.S. Lewis and stuff like that. There's people that take interest in guys that aren't in their communion, and obviously Severus would make sense for the Antiochians.
Severus, he's unique in that he reads like another one of the like he's cut from the cloth of that Greek tradition, because although he's the Patriarch of Antioch and we have him esteemed in the Syriac church, he wasn't a Syriac, he was a Greek. So like where Jacob keeps kind of the theme that Ephraim starts and he writes in the same style, Severus doesn't. Severus reads like the Cappadocians or like Cyril.
Severus very much reads like a saint. And there's people that don't, and they're not saints. And when you read Severus, it's like you're reading a saint. It's a strange feeling from my perspective. But if I were to explain, well, what's it feel like when you're reading him? It's the way he synthesized the patristics on so many issues. He very much reads like a saint, and so I have this build up, hopefully, so people don't appreciate what I'm about to read from him.
I remember when I first started reading Severus, I was kind of intimidated to start reading Severus just because of how notorious his reputation is in Western scholarship. You know, just the name Severus of Antioch. So when I started reading him, I was working at Catholic Charities at the time, and I would read him like whatever when I was downtime, whatever. And I would just bust up laughing. And I've never read a theologian where I would laugh because he would destroy the argument, like Julian's arguments, so bad that it would be funny, like it's over. Like it's like a nuclear bomb on the guy. And really, like whatever Julianism was at the time, it's not here today. It died out mostly because of Severus, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's because ultimately speaking, the appeal of Julianism is if you don't think that hard about it, it's simple and it solves problems. But it did so at the expense of massive discontinuity with the patristics. That being said, with Severus, clearly Severus is going to uphold the Henoticon. He's going to uphold what Cyril talked about, the voluntary assumption of passions and death. His doctrine of original sin is strictly Cyrillian. It makes perfect sense. I'm going to quote letter 65 to Euproxius, paragraph 2. He said, since Adam was condemned to death after the transgression which was committed through the deceitfulness of the serpent, so with us also, who are sprung from them, the charges of disobedience have been confirmed. And we ourselves are dust, and to dust we return, and we are condemned to the curse and our creatures born in pains. And from that time we have been in subjection, being subject to lust and to the varied pleasure of this, according to the saying of the blessed Paul. Which is, he's talking about Romans 7, obviously. And so, right, he pretty much says, this is hereditary, this whole mode of living that's wrong, right? So again, this whole idea there's no original sin in the East, it's like, where do you get this from? But right, like you could have, if I said Cyril said that, you would not know the difference, obviously. It's the same thing. So that's letter 65 from Severus. Elsewhere, he makes passing comments, which are interesting because they'll sound wrong if you understand them the wrong way. So like, in letter 27 against Codicils of the Alexandrine, Severus speaks of Adam's original condition of being of immortality. Right? Now, he doesn't mean the same immortality, impassibility in the things that we're going to find that are spoken about by Julian. But that's why I point this out, because people will see words like that if you use them, and they'll automatically conclude, well, this person must be an aphthartodocetist. And it's like, no, you can't stop there, because aphthartodocetism has a specific definition, which we'll unpack. Now, Severus also asserted that Christ's humanity was not subject to corruptibility due to the hypostatic union. Though, now this is important, his humanity was, to quote him, corruptible by nature, for it was from the Virgin Mary, who is consubstantial with us. Nevertheless, it is incorruptible, and it is not in any way subservient to corruption on account of its union with the Word, which is by nature incorruptible. And that's in Theolates, chapter 143. And I quoted, this is a lot of these quotes, because I don't have access, I don't read Syriac, obviously. A lot of these are going to be from Jonathan Moss's book, Incorruptible Bodies. All right, so you could, a lot of quotes that will be from that book. It's important reading, though I think both of us have certain disagreements. The thesis of the book, but it's a very important book if you want to understand this issue.
Absolutely.
So the reason why I quote this is corruption is part of nature, but we just learned that Adam's original condition is of immortality. So we're going to find that Severus gives a very important reason why Adam was immoral despite being corruptible by nature or essence, right? Because I think the English translation really means essence or substance. So that being said, it didn't need to be subject to corruption for the same reason that I think Julian couldn't get his head out of, which was like what Cyril said, that the moment that flesh was incarnate in the Word of God's person and his hypostasis, to use the Cappadocian idea of the particular hypostasis, the moment that occurred, it ceased to be subject to corruption. It ceased to be subject to death, right? And this is why Christ voluntarily allowed this to happen. But the nature of humanity was the same. We're going to find there's always latent corruptibility despite in Adam before the fall. Latent corruptibility. It's corruptibility in potential. And that's what people don't get. This is super, super important for people to understand, because you don't understand that, you're not going to say the whole patristic synthesis on the question. Now, I'm going down in my notes, so I apologize for the pause. Severus talks about I like to call it economic conversation, this voluntary assumption of the aspects of the fall that are blameless and sinless. In letter 35 to the monks of the East, in paragraph 4, Severus writes, God united to himself those of our passions which do not fall under the description of sin. So, right, blameless passions. He literally pretty much calls it that. Wishing in it to taste our death voluntarily, destroy its dominion over us, and by means of the resurrection to set us free in incorruptibility. Right? So we attain to corruptibility through Christ's resurrection, and we're going to find exactly how that works. And it's in actually one of the footnotes in Jonathan Moss's book. So if you don't read the footnotes, you miss out on a lot of good stuff. But God united to himself the blameless passions. This is important because we're going to find that Julian will refuse to confess this. And so the voluntary assumption of death and passibility is not aphthartodocetism. It's aphthartodocetism if you refuse to recognize the way this worked was through the blameless passions. So Severus wrote elsewhere, and this is in letter 1 to Ecumenis, he hungered and thirsted and slept and grew weary after a journey and wept and feared. These things did not happen to him just as they do to us. So just to point out, these are very clearly blameless passions, right? None of these things are other kinds of sins. There's no way Julian could have been confused, right? These things did not happen to him just as they do to us in accordance with the compulsory ordinances of nature, right? So it's compulsory that happens for us because we're sinful. It wasn't compulsory for Jesus. Why? But he himself voluntarily permitted his flesh to walk according to the laws of nature. Why do I point this out also? There's a misnomer that when Christ voluntarily assumed passions and death, it was like this one and done decision at the incarnation. But for the Eastern Orthodox and St. John of Damascus and St. Maximus, and here we see in Severus, who predates them, right? So that's why we have to appreciate Severus on this question. That he himself voluntarily permitted his flesh to walk according to laws. To walk. This is something he did his whole life. Every occurrence of Christ's life was a condescension, was an economy, is the Greek term economia. Very, very important, very misunderstood. But you see that right in Christ's whole life was this voluntarily, and to quote St. John of Damascus, was not arbitrary. What's the word? The point is, every moment of Christ's life was an exercise in economia, right? This is what Severus talked about. Please interrupt.
Let me ask you this. So,
Sure.
and I wanted to kind of keep questions to the end, but this question keeps coming up. So let's just get it out of the way. How would you summarize what Julianism is? What is Julianism?
All right, I wanted to build up to it, but being that you asked me, I'll skip down to it and hopefully not lose my place too badly.
Okay.
Now, Julianism has two central tenets which are wrong, and I call them two chief errors. First, he taught that corruptibility was physically impossible before the fall. All right. Now, like the quote Julian, he said, if this is in his tome, so this is Julian's own words, if the body were naturally corruptible, it would have been corrupted also before the transgression of Adam and Eve. Right? So he says that's impossible. But as we're going to find out in a moment, St. Irenaeus, St. Theophilus of Antioch, St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. John Chrysostom, I mean, from the 2nd century on, they actually teach, no, man was always corruptible and potential. So Julian's first error is that he's neglecting a consensus, very early teaching the saints, which is I think certainly apostolic. It first finds itself in a book from St. Irenaeus called Demonstration of Apostolic Preaching, which is allegedly him writing down oral traditions from the apostles. And so it's kind of bad when you ignore the oral tradition of the apostles. That's all I can tell you. It usually doesn't end up too good for you. So that's the first chief error of Julian, that corruptibility did not exist before the fall. All right, so that's number one. Number two, Christ did not have blameless passions. All right, this is very important because, how do you have passibility without blameless passions? Why do you think it's called aphthartodocetism? Right? It's the appearance of passibility then, because blameless passions are passibility. And so it gets weirder, and I'll unpack this a little later. But essentially, what Julian was really expounding was Christ had a similar human essence. It wasn't the same. And in fact, Adam before the fall had a similar human essence, but it really wasn't the same. That the fall essentially permanently damaged human essence. And what St. Maximus in my tradition would figure out later is how do we prevent this issue? How do we clarify this? He said, it's not the human substance or essence that changed. Obviously, no saint ever taught that. It's the human tropos that changed. And so meaning the way the nature operates, the way the essence, the substance operates, that's what changed. We're going to find that's in Severus. Severus predates this. But it was necessary. Why? Because it was necessary to disprove Julianism. So Julianism, in short, is there's no corruptibility before the fall, whether in potential or at all. It's just not part of human nature. And two, Christ did not experience blameless passion. So when he voluntarily accepted passibility, it was like this bizarre, this bizarre suspension of the laws of human substance, essence, nature, right? Like they were suspended so Christ could be passible. And it wasn't through the operation of the blameless passions. And so then it was only the appearance of actual passibility. Hence, aphthartodocetism. And so when people will say that, St. Hilary Poitiers is an aphthartodocetist, the term blameless passion, as far as I'm aware, wasn't even part of the Latin tradition in the 4th century. So you can't ascribe him the idea. It would have been impossible because he couldn't ascribe to one of the doctrines that Julian actually did, right? So this is something that comes up. I think in discourse, people will accuse Hilary Poitiers of being aphthartodocetist, but it would have been impossible because one of the chief tenets of aphthartodocetism just doesn't make sense in the Western tradition. They don't really have this doctrine of blameless passion. So you could say, then it was a defect of a lack of knowledge in that part of the Western tradition, and not say, we need all the traditions because that's what rounds them all out. There's right until Cyril wrote about the voluntary assumption of of death and passability, we only had Western saints talking about it, including St. Hilary, right? So we need both our communion saints. So anyway, do you have any other questions on the definition?
Thank you, Craig. So I think the viewers are interested because they want to see the difference between our kind of anthropology and then the heretical one, so that they know how to kind of split up these categories.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think on this particular question, St. John of Damascus is very useful for all of us, because he was kind of similar to Severus, where he could synthesize things and put it way more simply than Maximus. Like Bernard's Damascene is St. Maximus, but where you could actually understand it. That's the usefulness of his thought for the Eastern Orthodox. And the word I was looking for when I said, so we saw in Severus where he said the whole walk of Christ's life was his voluntary assumption of these blameless passions. To quote St. John of Damascus, the way he puts it is, for he, that's Christ, willingly and spontaneously accepted with that which was natural, so that fear itself and terror and agony belong to the natural innocent passions and are not under the dominion of sin. And I think that's chapter 23, or is it? Yeah, it's chapter 23 in book 3, exposition. So the reason I say that's spontaneous, it's when Christ wanted to. It's what I quoted in Christopher Veneman in the beginning of this presentation. This thing that scandalizes people, it's in my saints anyway, but it's also in your saints. It's in Severus. This is an idea I don't think is negotiable. And I think Damascene gives us a pretty good definition of aphthartodocetism, which will sound less Craigese, right? Like the one I just gave you is Craigese. This will sound more like what you actually hear Severus writing again. So I'm going to quote St. John of Damascus only because I think it's useful for our purposes. And I think it's the same. No, it's chapter 28, the same book. He says, all the human sufferings, such as hunger, thirst, weariness, the piercing with nails, death, that is separation of soul and body, and so forth. In this sense, we say that our Lord's body was subject to corruption, for he voluntarily accepted all these things, right? Pretty obvious. Wherefore, to say that with that foolish Julianus of Halicarnassus and Gaius, if I remember, wasn't Gaius the patriarch of Alexandria set against Theodosius of Alexandria? Am I getting the right guy?
Yeah.
Right? So Gaius is no minor person. That our Lord's body was incorruptible in the first sense of the word before his resurrection is impious. For if it were incorruptible, it was not really, but only apparently of the same essence as ours, right? Because human essence, human substance is corruptible. Otherwise, how would we corrupt? We wouldn't be human anymore, right? We'd be something else. And what the gospel tells us happened, the hunger, the thirst, the nails, the wound in his side, the death, did not actually occur. But if they then only apparently occurred, then the mystery of the dispensation is an imposture and a sham. And he became man only in appearance and not in actual fact. And we are saved only in appearance and not in actual fact. Right? So we see this condemnation of Julian from St. John Damascus. And sometimes people say the saints will take the heretics and misquote them. And this is not a saint for you guys, obviously. But the point is, no, this is not a misquoting. Severus would say the same exact thing. No, this is exactly what Julian is saying. And the funny thing is, Julian would not disagree with what was said, with the tenets of it, because he's not being misunderstood. And that's what I want to unpack here. The scholars, though, disagree with me. So I'm going to want you guys to weigh in when I get into the primary sources, because I'm going to quote the scholarship on this, and I'm going to try to challenge you. So Yonatan Moss in Incorruptible Bodies says that Julian acknowledged Christ's full humanity and the reality of his sufferings. Thus, Julian cannot fairly be called a Docetist. Julian's solution was to say that Christ voluntarily accepted upon himself the conditions of bodily passibility and mortality. His body truly did suffer hunger, thirst, and fatigue, but this did not happen out of natural necessity. It happened by will, right? So that doesn't sound so wrong, right? If you go, well, if that's Julianism, well, that really actually doesn't sound wrong. And so he then, in the footnote, quotes Julian saying as follows, and it doesn't sound wrong. Julian writes, "Let us not state that the body of our Lord was passible and mortal due to compulsion, and in this matter corruptible and subservient to natural necessities. Rather, let us confess that it was voluntarily, as in truth, that he endured the redemptive sufferings for us and his vivifying death." So you see right there, he says it's voluntary. It wasn't from compulsion. It sounds like the same exact thing. But here's where I want to challenge you. There is a subtle but profound difference between Severus and Julian. Neither were stupid people. And I think us moderns want to say that they're speaking past each other, but it's not the case. Now, to quote Yonatan Moss again, he says that Julian did not disagree with Severus about the fact of Jesus' sufferings, right? We just say, and in truth is what Julian said about Christ's sufferings. His disagreement was about the explanation of this fact. Now, what I propose to you, dear audience, is the explanation is extremely important. It's not like an optional, you say potato, I say potato thing. It's like, no, you need this explanation. Severus taught, according to Moss, that Jesus' body suffered by the physical necessity of it being a body, while Julian believed that Jesus' body did not suffer by necessity. But we read above, actually, that Severus did teach that Christ didn't have to suffer and corrupt and all these things by necessity, as we do, according to the ordinances of the laws of nature. So we could already see, despite Moss's phenomenal scholarship, he's actually not being accurate with Severus. And I think it's because the doctrine of tentative immortality before the fall, whatever you want to call that doctrine, is not being appreciated. Because if you appreciate that, then we could see where Severus is coming from, but not where Julian's coming from. Because Julian would actually reject that doctrine of tentative immortality for the fall. Now, we went over the two chief errors of Julian, which is he rejected the blameless passions and that humanity was incorruptible according to its essence and substance as a default. Now, I want people to remember, though, that Julian's whole idea kind of appealed to people's spirituality at this time. If you read the Desert Fathers and other hagiographic sources, the idea was if you become so holy, your death could become totally involuntary. So the idea was, wow, people could become glorified in this life, which is wrong, by the way. We don't become glorified. We get glorified bodies in the resurrection. But the idea, even the Theotokos, she was resurrected after her death to have a glorified body. And she's the first, by the way. So that being said, Julian tried to explain, well, how could we have glorified bodies? And it was through these spiritual disciplines. So it had like this built-in audience that wanted to accept it because they understood the utility of the spiritual disciplines. But Severus was way too smart for this, and we'll unpack the Severian solution to this, which is also the Eastern Orthodox. It's the Orthodox solution to this problem. Again, no one talks about, wait, I can become so holy where I cannot die, right? That sounds crazy, but Moss talks about this. This was taken for granted in those days. And if you read the ascetic works, the spiritual works of the church, it goes way into the second millennium. This is something that everyone understands if they actually read this stuff. People interacting with, this is me on my soapbox, I'm sorry. People interacting with apologetics, they just talk about that Pope, just talk about that filioque, but they're never actually getting into any of the spiritual stuff. And if you don't understand the spiritual stuff, you're not going to understand this issue.
Yeah, that's what systematic theology is.
It's very systematic.
Julian's error comes from his misunderstanding of what true humanity is. It's
absolutely.
That's the main thing with that.
And so, that being said, we already talked about how in Irenaeus, Theophilus, Chrysostom, Gregory, and Nyssa, they had this view of the tentative immortality of humanity before the fall. But the keyword's tentative. Now, I want to point out that corruptibility always exists in a potential. This led to later saints in the Eastern Orthodox communion, like Maximus, to expound upon how what was altered by original sin was not always nature, essence, substance, because that was always corruptible, but the human tropos, whose change permitted the onset of latent corruptibility. Now, because Julian says that Christ never really had blameless passions, I think then you cannot have this whole idea of tropos. And so then you don't ever get the Maximus solution, which we Orthodox need, but then you don't get what Severus has either. Now, let's see. I'm going to read a very long quote from Severus. I'll try to speak emphatically, and then we're going to unpack it. I have to read it as a whole. Because I think if people chewed on this, this one block quote will end all misunderstandings about aphthartodocetism, which is why I have to read it. So before I bore everyone, is there anything you want to do to interrupt, Subdeacon?
No, please go for it, Craig.
All right, so we're going to jump into it. And so it says, for by its nature, the body was mortal and corruptible, and it was innately prone to dissolve back into the elements out of which it was composed. All right, innately prone. Did it? No. Wasn't corrupting, but it was prone to. All right, that tenet of immortality. Severus continues, the body was not susceptible, however, to the operation of death, for man was not initially made to be subjected to death's snares, i.e. he was tentatively immortal. Nor was he made to be elevated above nature, to be immortal. Rather, he was to be preserved immortal for everlasting life by the divine grace and will. Right? This is the doctrine of deification. So you need the energy essence distinctions for this. And this is in Severus. And so, I find this incredible. If you're really into this stuff, this is incredible what he's saying. Severus continues. For the natural state of things, which demands that composites become decomposed, cannot withstand the will of God. By the will and grace of God, this evil was not to have any effect on humans. All right, I got to unpack this a little. I don't want to bore you guys. What's this stuff about composite? The only incomposite being technically is God. Now, St. Gregory Nyssa says angels are incomposite, but according to Aristotelian metaphysics, what is composite is corruptible and deteriorates, and what is incomposite is incorruptible by default. Okay? And so what Severus is saying, he's actually kind of expecting your Aristotle. He's saying that humanity is a composite nature. It's body, it's soul. St. Irenaeus said body, soul, and spirit. But the point is it's composite. It's a nature made of multiple natures. Or essence, I want to use a more neutral term. An essence or substance made of composed of multiple essence or substances. That may sound wrong to Oriental Orthodox. You may have a different way of explaining it, so please forgive me, but that makes sense the way I'm explaining it in my own community.
Sure.
And so, that being said, it's a composite. In a sense, human essence is a composite essence, just like Christ's hypostasis is a composite hypostasis according to essences. Right, so it's not all that strange if you think about it, and so, but that means by default, if we understand Aristotle, it's corruptible. So why weren't we corrupting before the fall? We were preserved by God's energies, by His grace and will. Right, that's the answer Severus gives, but it's the same exact answer that St. Gregory Palamas would give, and it's in Severus. So anyway. We also find, for example, let's say St. Phronius of Jerusalem, who's an Eastern Orthodox saint, by the way, that even angels have to be, their existence is upheld by grace, that they're not immortal as a default. They're not incorruptible as a default. St. Gregory Nyssa would disagree with that, by the way. But this whole idea takes for granted it's whether you're composite or not. That's the point at issue. So anyway, Severus continues, rather he was to be preserved immortal, that's Adam, for everlasting life by the divine grace and will, for the natural state of things which demands that composites become decomposed cannot withstand the will of God. By the will and grace of God, this evil was not to have any effect on humans, rather mortality was to be swallowed up by life, for the divine grace was to draw up nature. Was to. So what's he talking about? This actually shows you that Severus' doctrine of resurrection is the same as the Eastern Orthodox doctrine of resurrection, which was worked out during the monothelite controversy in the 7th century. So he predates, the solution he gives to aphthartodocetism predates the own wrestlings that the Eastern Orthodox will have in the 7th century. And so Adam was tentatively immortal because as long as he didn't sin, he wouldn't set his body into the course of corruption and passions and the things that kill us and all that, right? But, as we can see here in Severus, the divine grace was to draw up nature. So if Adam continued cooperating with that grace of God and was obedient, that's what would have gave him a glorified body. So it didn't happen yet. The glorified body is the same as the body we have now. It's the same human essence and substance. The difference is we then beget a deified nous, And once our nous is deified, then we'll always, at all times, will God's will, work God's work, receive his energies, and then we can never corrupt, die. We'll be deified forever, and it will increase forever. And so this is something that comes up a lot when I do apologetics, immaculate conception, all that stuff, because it's not appreciated. I'm not saying that people will reject it outright, but people never heard about this. But it's in Severus. I just read it in Severus, right? Severus understood the point at issue. And he understood this is actually what salvation is. That's why this is non-negotiable, because you can't have salvation, right, without this doctrine of tentative immortality. Because then you would change the human nature that's being saved, like what I just read St. John of Damascus saying. Yeah. All right. So it's, to me, I know this is mind blowing. If you really are into this stuff, absolutely mind blowing. And to me, compared to some things, Severus is actually pretty easy to follow. At least again, if you're kind of initiated in this, Severus is kind of, that's his utility as a theologian. He's got the brilliance, but he also could kind of put it pretty straight. Now, let me continue. That which dissolves composite things in actual reality began, while the soul, due to the transgression, necessarily suffered separation from God. Right? So the soul now separates from God because of transgression. And the disturbing commotion of the passions, by which the body is known, and account of which is called corruptible, consumed the soul as well. They come into being and grow by means of the passions of nature. Exactly the answer that St. Maximus gave before. Start to desire, then the blameless passion, and then you get to blameworthy passion, right? What we see Severus say is that the blameworthy passions, they come into being and grow by the means of the passions of nature. So he predates Maximus with the theological solution. It's positively brilliant. It's positively brilliant. Now, it is thus clear that it was the transgression that first initiated the condemnation to corruption and death. And it was not the fact that Adam's body had been composite, which made it innately prone to dissolve back into the elements out of which it was composed. Right? So he puts it very straight. It's not like Adam was already corrupting, right? That's not me saith. You see it right there in Severus. It was because of the transgression that divorced us from the grace of God. And that's what makes the fall. Is that that divorce we have between God and ourselves when it comes to his grace. And the Greek term that Maximus would push would be tropos. So anyway, Severus continues, for it is not difficult for God, the maker of all, to remove corruption from the life of one who is overcome by corruption, and to preserve him for everlasting life. So right, again, that whole answer that it would be God for eternity upholding us with grace. That's why we're immortal and glorified. Just as he, God, elevates the things of his own nature above corruption. All right, and that's interesting. Like God by his own nature above corruption. It almost seems like he's presupposing, again, the energy essence distinction, right? So anyway, we see here that let me give a summary, unless you have any questions on what I just said. I'm going to give a summary to try to break apart in bullet points what we just read. Prelapsarian human nature, humanity, human substance, essence, before the fall, to quote Severus, was mortal and corruptible, not due to it actually corrupting and dying, but rather it was innately prone, to quote him, to mortality and death. So in other words, prelapsarian humanity was tentatively immortal as long as it was sinless, as the earlier saints taught. So Severus is showing continuity, unlike Julian. Now, the body was not susceptible to death, according to Severus, because it was, to quote him, preserved immortal by the divine grace, contingent upon obedience and sinlessness. Now, sin and transgression initiated the mortality of the body, and thereby ending tentative immortality. What literally causes death, to quote Severus, is separation from God, which as default allows the commotion of passions, these passions rightly making the body both physically and spiritually corruptible. God's grace, I think there might be an implication of the atonement, but I'm not going to unpack that now, corrects this condition. All right? So that's why we need God's grace. That's why Christ came to the world. That's why he was incarnate. That's why he died. That's why he rose again. These are all atoning. They all enable God's grace to give us eternal life. Now, how does this differ with Julian? We got I think this is in the Syriac Chronicle. Let me get the quotation right. It's in Zechariah Middeline, Syriac Chronicle, Book 9, Chapter 16. There's recorded a conversation between Severus and Julian. And you'll hear now Julian, in his own words, be a heretic. This foolish man, says Severus, who confesses the passions with his lips only, hiding his impiety, wrote thus: Incorruptibility was always attached to the body of our Lord, which was passible of his own will for the sake of others. And in brotherly love, I wrote and asked him. So Severus responds to Julian, what we just heard. What do you mean by incorruptible, and suffered of his own will for the sake of others, and was attached to the body of our Lord, if without any falsehood you confess it to be by nature passible? For if by the incorruptibility possessed by it you mean holiness without sin, we all confess this with you. But if you call impassibility and immortality incorruptibility, and say that the body which suffered in the flesh on our behalf was not the one that was capable of suffering with voluntary passions and dying in the flesh, you reduce the saving passions on our behalf to a fantasy. Right? So it's not just the passion of the cross, right? The passion of Christ. The passions, the whole human experience of Christ is salvific. So anyway, Severus continues, for if a thing which does not suffer also does not die, and it is a thing incapable of suffering. And upon receiving such remarks as these from me, he, that's Julian, openly refused to call his body of Emmanuel passible in respect of voluntary passions. So, right, this is aphthartodocetism. He refused to confess voluntary passions. He continues, and therefore he did not hesitate to write thus without shame and openly. So we know this is not him misquoting like an oral conversation. He's quoting writings that people had access to. And so look what Julian says. We do not call him of our nature in respect of passions, but in respect of essence. Right? So Christ is not of our essence in respect of passion, but supposedly just strictly he's passible in respect of essence. So it's like the suspension of natural law, like I was referring to before.
Sure.
Therefore, even if he is impassible and even if he's incorruptible, yet he is of our nature in respect of nature. Right? That makes no sense, actually, right? So he has a suspension of natural law, but he doesn't have passion. So he's passible without actually the reason why human nature, essence, substance is passible. It makes no sense, which is why he has a tautology there, right? He's of our nature in respect of nature. He just said the same thing twice. What's that even mean? And I think when a heretic doesn't say, yes, of course you have blameless passions, because he's rejecting it. Right? That's the problem. He's rejecting an essential tenet of Christ's voluntary suffering and death. Now, I think some people will try to vindicate Julian and think, like, well, maybe he didn't know that blameless passion is the point at issue or something like that. But I think this whole discussion of Christ's essence having passibility according to essence shows you that his anthropology is incorrect. His understanding of human nature is incorrect. He doesn't believe in tentative immortality. That's the real point and issue, right? It's in respect of essence that he identifies passibility, not in respect of what it actually is, in respect to the blameless passions. Now, the anthropological difference as it surrounds the blameless passions is nuanced. We got to take some time to talk about this because there are concrete differences. Severus asserts that human glorification is the permanent abiding in grace, like we just read. The permanence of this condition creating eternal impassibility and corruptibility, right? A sinful volition of the soul by necessity engages the passions, corruptibility, and death, right? The fallen tropos. So conceptually, it's identical to Maximus, like I was saying before. Hence, it is never human nature, essence, substance that changes, but human volition, right? The tropos. That's what changes. Now, I think maybe, so better people than me could look this up, but maybe this comes from Nemesis of Emesa, because Nemesis predates both Severus and Maximus. It'd be interesting if that's the case, but I don't think Nemesis used tropos in the term, but maybe the concept is from Nemesis. I'd be interested for someone to follow up on that. Yet for Julian, Christ voluntarily assumes passibility and corruptibility, but not its cause, the passions. So to posit this requires that Christ had a fundamentally different humanity, as the only reason all other humans experience passibility and corruptibility is because they experience the passions. They're one complete package. So it's like he has a different human essence because that different human essence could be passible for entirely different reasons, right? So the anthropology is all wrong. And if a different human substance or essence is what went to the cross and what was resurrected, that doesn't save us at all. So that's the problem with what Julian is saying. Now, he indeed confessed Christ experienced passibility and corruption. And I think what draws this out, Severus writes that Theodosius to Alexandria and the latter's enthronement encyclical. People don't know this for some reason. But even like the Pope of Rome, everyone had enthronement encyclicals. And it's because to be a patriarch, you need the consent of your consecration from the other patriarchs. For some reason, like people don't know this, but this is very basic. And the Roman patriarch stopped doing this in the 11th century because the whole idea that your validity demands that there's consent of the other patriarchs is a radically different ecclesiastical presumption than what exists in Orthodoxy. So anyway, Severus wrote to Theodosius that Julius made the sufferings of Christ false because an impassible and mortal body does not admit of sufferings and death, but is considered to have suffered and died only in surmise and as it were in an illusion of sleep. Right? So like the same thing we saw in John of Damascus. Because again, he's saying that it's passable, but it's not blameless passion. So it just looks like blameless passions. Hence aphthartodocetism. Now, I think this whole issue hinges on blameless passions. And this will be my final proof text. Or like that nail in the coffin. Evagrius, in his slander against St. Justinian, may be quoting something that really happened because the hagiographies do say that Justinian had an aphtharodocetist phase. And in the decree that Justinian made, it said that the body of Christ was, quoting the decree, incorruptible and not susceptible to the natural and blameless passions. I'm going to repeat that again. And not susceptible to the natural and blameless passions. So what is aphtharodocetism? The idea that Christ's body was not susceptible to the natural and blameless passions. Why is this something that everyone then understood? Like what was that, 7 words or something? But people just don't understand at all today. I don't know. It's really not that complicated. That is what aphtharodocetism is. And it shows you that Evagrius knew the point at issue. So if this is all a forgery, which probably isn't, but if we're all a forgery, like it shows you why would he choose this as the definition of aphtharodocetism? Because obviously that's the definition of aphtharodocetism. That's why. Now, I think that the reason we don't understand this today, and this would be my closing thoughts for your questions, audience questions, is if economic conversation, Christ's voluntary assumption of the passion, the blameless passions and death, if this was understood and readily confessed by people today, this would not even be an argument, right? Like we wouldn't be confused about it. We'd all take it for granted. Like, you know your Henoticon, we would know our Council Constable 3. There would be no confusion about this. But because no one's ever heard of this, right? It's like when I bring it up, it's like no one's ever heard of this. It's crazy that now this is confusing. So if I have any axe to grind, it's people need to understand the doctrine of Christ's voluntary passion. And if you understand that, then aphtharodocetism is not that confusing. I just want to close so people know that this presentation was, I kind of imagine, it was supposed to be me in Greece. Didn't we talk about this? I was supposed to be going to Greece?
Yes.
I think we had this conversation. And I'll just say my wife's country opened the borders to people like me again. You could read in between those lines, right? And so I couldn't fly internationally twice a year. I had to cancel going to the IOTA conference. So this presentation on the Lion's Den was going to be essentially my academic paper, which I was going to present at the IOTA conference in Volos, Greece. And it was going to be called Economic Conversation. No, it's going to be called Discretionary Manner of Living, the Doctrine, the Most Important Dogma You Never Heard of. Right? That's pretty much, this is the backbone of what that presentation was going to be. And so, yes, if you understand that most important dogma, then aphtharodocetism is not complicated. If, however, you don't understand that dogma, then you're going to be accusing things of aphtharodocetism that aren't. And that's pretty much my thoughts on the issue.
Thank you so much, Craig. I appreciate it. I just want to also put in a 2 cents kind of a summary thing on this. Julianism, it's so easy to misunderstand it nowadays because off the bat, it might not the error of it might not be so glaring to a Christian who is saying, "Oh, Christ is incorruptible." Well, of course he's incorruptible, you know. But then when you kind of get into the nuance, if I'm allowed to use that word, on this is
I think it's a charitable way to put it. But that's a meme now. Everything's charitable and nuanced.
okay. So it's that if before the resurrection, like this is the end all be all, then you've been beating the horse the whole show. Um, so before the resurrection, if his humanity naturally experienced those things or optionally experienced it, and then that's the end of the question. If the answer is naturally, so then that's orthodox, and if the answer is optionally, so then we have a problem. What kind of humanity is this? It's not our humanity. And like St. Gregory said, it's only what was put on. I don't remember the Greek word. In Syriac, we say put on. It was only what
Okay.
was put on that was redeemed. Was
Yeah.
assumed, you guys say.
I think it's assumed, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so that's the end of the question, I think, for Julianism. And thank you very much, Craig. I appreciate it. We had questions. One of the questions I have to go up in the chat, but I'll just tell you what it is.
Sure.
One of the questions is, do you have any information regarding Dr. Price's upcoming on the Sixth Ecumenical Council?
Yeah, it's already translated.
Okay.
The issue is Dr. Price isn't the subject matter expert in the 7th century. That's why you had Phil Booth and forget her name, but there another scholar with Lateran 649. And so I actually know the person, but for sake of his privacy, I won't disclose his name. It's a very dense issue, and so I hope not to be waiting years, but there's no reason why it can't be 15 years from now, unless Father Richard Price forces the issue over residuals, because these things tend not to get published until all the footnotes are done, and that's really what it's waiting for.
Awesome. And then there's another
But as
question.
long as we don't die young,
Yeah.
in some form, they're eventually going to come out with this thing, so we will get the council.
Sure. Okay, we have another question. Let's see. Can Craig explain what does potential or latent corruptibility post-fall is? Like an example of a latent potential blameless passion, latent or potential hunger or thirst or fatigue.
Yeah, I think maybe some of this, some one maybe because Romanian there's a English second language thing here, and two, even when you know English really well, I'm speaking New Yorkese, so maybe it's not coming out super great. I'm sorry. Right, the English I speak here is different than the English I speak in Chicago and all that. But that aside, tenet of immortality is a state. It's not like a passion. In fact, it exists because there's a state of dispassion, right? Adam and Eve were in a state of dispassion, and it's incredible if you think about it. It means like they were able to eat food in the garden, but it wasn't necessary for their continued existence, nor did they get pleasure from it, right? So like, what's a good ham sandwich taste like without the passions? I'm not sure. It tastes like a ham sandwich. Physical stimuli exist, but our whole mode of like deriving pleasure is not something that preexists the fall. And so, being that that's the case, the tenet of immortality is because we had a mind that was operating the way it ought to, right? So I have like these kind of quote minds for this whole doctrine, and I call the name of the quote mine is the prelapsarian mind. And the reason I called it the prelapsarian mind, because people have to understand, how did the human mind work before the fall? What did the fathers say? And they're pretty much all teaching the same paradigm that St. Maximus talks about. And it was the same paradigm that Severus talks about. So I hope that answers what you're trying to get in the question, because the question as asked otherwise doesn't make sense.
Sure.
So I'm sorry.
Sure. Okay, another question. Also, I don't want to go up in the chat. I'll just tell you. How can we relate what we talked about, Orthodox anthropology versus heretical anthropology, to modern day theological dialogue, especially maybe with the Roman Catholic Church?
Well, for one, and this crosses a little bit over into certain Eastern Orthodox thinkers. Meyendorff has been accused of it. It, in what I read, it looks like it, but I don't know. The point is there are two camps, and I call them Christological prelapsarianist and Christological postlapsarianist. And the idea that Christ had fallen flesh makes positively no sense if you know the doctrine of Christ's voluntary assumption of the blameless passions and death, right? If you have this doctrine economic conversation, you would never even a million years think he had fallen post-lapsarian flesh. Because then what was he volunteering for? Right? Like Cyril would never say this. The moment to quote Cyril, the moment his flesh was incarnate, right? It ceased to have any corruptibility or anything whatsoever. Right? But corruptibility as in it wasn't corrupting, not that it didn't have the natural or essential or substantial potential for corruption. It obviously did, and that's what Christ voluntarily allowed to occur. He allowed his human nature to experience something that could human essence, human substance, to experience something that it could suffer from sin without being sinful. Right? It's like, and that's atoning. That's why the whole walk, as Severus talks about, is atoning. Right? And so the real issue, for one, is post-lapsarianism. Now, I could go on a million years and then it gets into stuff with Immaculate Conception, because there are different camps within Roman Catholicism on that issue. But that will then go to other questions. So I'll leave that aside. I just simply say, whatever our doctrine is, we have to affirm what is dogmatic, and obviously that's Christ's voluntary passion and death. But I also want to point out, as maybe an olive branch, is you and I and Catholic Matt, we solved the Immaculate Conception on Nicaea 2025, right? We all came to an agreement of what it could mean. And so, again, I think anything redefined appropriately could be technically correct. Yeah. So when I'm talking about post-lapsarianism, it's because there's no way it could be correct. It's absolutely positively false.
That's a perfect segue for this one right here. Do you want to elaborate on Severus' implications for the atonement?
Yeah. In short, the atonement is Christ came and essentially canceled the law of death. Right? He put death to death. Like, I don't know if you guys have the same Paschal hymn. I'm guessing you do.
First hymn every Sunday.
Okay, right. Oh, lucky you. We only have it for 50 days. So
you guys attribute the hymn to Justinian. We attribute it to Severus. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, yeah. Christ is risen from that one.
I think so.
Yeah. So, but Justinian is another hymn that we do every liturgy. So maybe there's a misnomer here. But anyway, that being said, it's atoning, because the reason it's atoning is Christ's whole life was an undoing of what sin did. So we died because we sinned. Christ died because he chose not to. He didn't have to die, right? And so that cancels the law of death, right? We have pain because we sinned. Christ has pain, but he didn't have to have pain. He opted into it, though being sinless. So it cancels the law of pain, right? Christ, we have pain, and we have corruptibility, and we have a mind that don't work, and so we have blameworthy passions. Christ, he opted into the effects of a screwed up mind, but didn't have a screwed up mind. And so then that undoes the whole law of why blameworthy passions exist. So his entire existence is atoning. But all those things we just read were in that one big long block quote of Severus, right? And so that kind of, that mushy, ushy, gushy, view of the atonement. Why don't you just say he died on the cross and the blood paid some sort of penalty or something, it was some blood price or something, right? It was like some blood ransom. And there's a right way for it, but it wasn't strictly that, because the whole life was a ransom, right? Every moment he felt pain or weariness was a ransoming of our weariness, of our pain, and ultimately our deaths, right? If Christ has to come back first and we're not risen before our time. So, and this is something that, again, it was intrinsic to Severus' thought because we just read it. So,
thanks again, Craig. I appreciate it, bro. Is there anything You want to plug anything you want to say before we wrap it up?
I will say, I will plug something because I got something coming up tomorrow on my channel on the like Codex and Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and there's like textual critical things, the textual criticism of the scriptures. It's not terribly long. I think it's like 13 to 15 minutes, but I got a little episode of my channel. I moved up the date to tomorrow, so go to my channel and you could get into why it's not a big deal if there's manuscript differences. And why? Because here's the main idea I want to plug. The way we fundamentally look at the fathers, like the scriptures, we have to divorce it from this whole Western paradigm, which we can't help but have because we're speaking in English. But if we approach these things the Western paradigm, we're going to get everything wrong. That's why people get aphthartodocetism wrong. That's why they don't understand Christological dogmas like the one I've been talking about today. But also that's why like they'll have crises of faith over manuscript differences, over like, well, how do we know what's really in the scriptures? Not like, like a difference of a verse or a text type is really critical when we have saints that, like in your tradition, they have the Peshitta and and saints of the Septuagint, right? And one's based on the other, but you can have certain differences and whatnot. So being that's the case, it's why is that not a big deal for us? Well, you need to understand how we do theology. And if you don't understand how we do theology, it ultimately is going to take you in the wrong place and ultimately to nihilism. And so that's what I find so important. So we got to do a reset. We got to approach these things like the saints. That's why it takes prayer, and it takes fasting. It takes good works. It takes loving who you're reading. And so I would just leave it at that. So yeah, if we approach that, if you guys approach Severus like that, you're gonna get so much more out of Severus. If I approach Maximus like that, I'll get so much more out of Maximus. It's an essential interpretive principle.
Let me throw this in there, Craig. Do you, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, would you recommend Eastern Orthodox to read Severus?
I actually say no. I'm gonna be a hypocrite.
That's okay.
I'm going to be a hypocrite. And I think the reason why we're in times that are too ecumenist, where I think most people can't responsibly read them. And it's like a siren call from my perspective, right? He's a condemned heretic in my communion.
Yeah.
And so he's too beautiful where I think most people can handle him rightly. from my perspective.
Perfect answer, bro.
Yeah, so and I think in general, most people shouldn't be reading this academic stuff. I think the only reason this particular video would be useful, even if it's pretty heady, is because it's pretty much telling people don't listen to all this academic nonsense and just take for granted the dogmas in the church. And that's what people need to be doing. I think people too often want to reinvent and understand everything, and this is kind of novel in the Christian experience. I'm sure like old school Syriac Orthodox and old school Antiochian Orthodox, like people back in the old countries, they're not sitting around thinking about this stuff because, this is stuff that people get because they went to college and they're working in Applebee's and they're actually doing it for a living and they're thinking about it too much. You don't need to think about this stuff too much in order to be a faithful Christian. And I think a lot of the problems we have is because we're trying to get answers to stuff when we should be praying, when we should be reading the scriptures, we should be really spending time with God.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again, man. I want to end the show with the quote you always give from Cyril. Go for it.
You're going to quote it, I'm going to fight to death for truth. The Lord God will fight for you.
There it is.
Lion's Den, signing out.
See you, everybody. Take care.